Hi everyone, Sean here, and welcome to Lines in Sand. Today, I am going to take you on a journey that will take us far from the usual material covered on this channel. Recently, I finished reading Thoth, Architect of the Universe, a book by Ralph Ellis, a writer and researcher of both biblical and Egyptian histories. Ralph got in touch last year regarding the video I did about Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert's Orion correlation theory. He very kindly sent me some copies of his own work, and now it is time to talk about that. Thoth, Architect of the Universe, asks some big questions, but provides some big claims and big maths to back that up. Today we are essentially going to be not only talking about Giza, but Dashur, Stonehenge, Avebury, Silbury, and even Teotihaucan, which I've probably butchered, in Mexico. As I said, this is a little bit different than the usual laser focus on an Egyptian pyramid or two, but I took the time to read Ralph's book and decided the theory was well worth a deep dive. We have, after all, covered a few quote-unquote alternative theories here on the channel before. So the questions we are posing here: are the ancient monuments of the world connected? Was there a universal architect that orchestrated all of these construction projects? What was the timeline and time frame of their creation? And why were they created? It's going to be a long one, so get yourself a drink and get comfortable. Let's begin. Opening the book, Ralph states that his work, Thoth, is, quote, controversial and revolutionary answers to the design and function of the great henges and pyramids, end quote. The opening chapters of the book ask whether the great monuments of the world hold secret messages for the future, whether together as some sort of unified plan where one complements the others. Can we decode ancient statements that were then left behind? What would be the purposes of such messages, and what would they contain? Suggesting up front that many of the world's most famous historical sites are somehow linked to each other, perhaps even all created by one master architect, is a very bold mission statement, one that I'm sure for many falls on the wrong side of alternative thinking, and deep into the realms of pseudo-archaeology and unfounded conspiracy. The difference here with the monumental work that is Thoth, pun slightly intended, is that the author attempts to present as much evidence as possible to support his thinking. Evidence, as we all know, being that important ingredient that is often missing from some of the more outlandish propositions and theories around the pyramids and other ancient structures. I'm not saying that Ralph has the right of it, but his work and his research is so in-depth that it would have been quite ignorant for me to dismiss it after reading it. Here in the video then, I will attempt to present and analyse the evidence Ralph gives for his unusual proposition. There is a lot of mathematical work in this book, and for the purposes of time and the difficulty of translating that kind of thing into a compelling essay, I will be excluding most of the technical detail in that regard from the script. I will try to keep it as simple as possible, and if I don't understand something, which did happen several times in my read-through, then I will also advise you of that as well. Now, it's not uncommon for people to associate the value of pi to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Many over the years have attempted to attribute meaning to this, whilst just as many people have written it off as some sort of strange coincidence. There's also the proposition that the Great Pyramid is on a scaled ratio with the circumference of the Earth. And this is something that I've heard Graham Hancock talk about on podcasts and what have you, and the ratio is so ridiculous that it does kind of feel like it's just a number that's been found after many, many hours or days of searching for something that happens to fit. Ralph actually warns of this himself, stating, quote, anyone can find a ratio to fit any solution, end quote. Now, this is a problem that I've found with a lot of alternative trains of thought around the Great Pyramid and related ancient structures. It feels like any set of numbers or data can be massaged to fit the agenda of the author if one tries hard enough. And I'll be honest, it's also a reservation I carried with me as I started my analysis of this book. But the difference here, whether Ralph is right or wrong, is that Ralph shows his workings and in great detail. It was enough to get me from the beginning to the end, eager to understand everything that was trying to be conveyed. So in regards then to the Great Pyramid and pi, I'll quote directly from the text here. Quote, "The Great Pyramid, for example, is designed around the 2 times pi times radius formula of a circle. The perimeter length around the base of the pyramid is the equivalent of the perimeter of a circle, and the height of the pyramid represents the radius of the same circle." End quote. The book discusses whether or not the pi formula is likely to be a coincidence or not. The author also mentions that the Khafre pyramid has a similar formula, the same 2-4-5 Pythagorean triangle. We recently discussed this in a previous video about Khafre's pyramid, and this is often overlooked, again I think due to the gravity that the Great Pyramid has. It kind of dwarfs its neighbours, even the massive pyramid of Khafre. So, where does this lead? How do we put the first steps into motion for this enormous theory? Ellis starts then, a little bit further back, at the step pyramid of Giza. It's often said that the step pyramid is the first structure of its kind in human history. The first pyramid, as it were, risen by the guiding hand of Imhotep. A great dawn, perhaps, where mastaba becomes pyramid, the true beginning of a new pyramid age. Or is it? The author points to Silbury Hill, a burial mound made from chalk in the English county of Wiltshire. This is supposedly made with a stepped core, much like the one we see at Saqqara with Giza's pyramid. Ellis writes of the legend of King Zil, supposedly buried beneath Silbury Hill with his horse and golden armour. Much like the pharaohs of Egypt, King Zil was never found beneath his own earthen-clad chalk pyramid. The book goes as far as to suggest that the legend of King Zil was probably a later concoction, and that the true prehistoric builders of Silbury Hill are now lost to time. The author strikes out to compare the two monuments at Silbury and Saqqara, admitting that whilst Silbury Hill is flatter than Giza's pyramid, the similarities between the two stepped structures cannot be denied. He also suggests that the two constructions would have used the same volume of material, but I cannot verify this. Ellis then likens the technique used to cover the core of Silbury Hill to that of the Teotihuacan pyramids in Mexico. Once again, I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly. This is a fleeting link at this point, but it will come up again a bit later in the text. Regarding the similarities between Giza's pyramid and the chalk mound at Silbury Hill, I'll quote from Ralph directly here. Quote, "While it may seem inappropriate to compare the Silbury pyramid with Giza's pyramid, the designs are more similar than they initially appear. Just like Giza's pyramid, Silbury has had at least 3 enlargements to the structure, and the final edifice comprises a step pyramid containing 6 steps. Like many of the Egyptian step pyramids, each step at Silbury has large facing blocks, although here made of chalk, and a rubble interior. The steps were further subdivided into cells or segments, with the cell walls helping to stabilize the structure. At this stage in the construction, Silbury would have strongly resembled the step pyramid of Giza, excepting having a circular perimeter and being faced with gleaming white chalk." End quote. Further studies call some of the interior properties of Silbury Hill into question, but the point stands, I think. The manuscript here quickly moves on to the 3 Egyptian pyramids that followed Giza's but predate the pyramids of Giza, those being the Pyramid of Meidum, the so-called Red Pyramid, and the so-called Bent Pyramid. The latter two are often associated with the pharaoh Sneferu, and the Bent Pyramid is often rather annoyingly referred to as an architectural failure or mistake. Really, when you look deep enough at this structure, that clearly is not the case. There have been lots of good videos on this on YouTube. I will link some of them below. Anyway, Ralph Ellis, operating under the decision that the pyramids are indeed not tombs, and to be honest, even if they were tombs, this point would still stand. Why would Sneferu need 2 pyramids? Or 3 in this case, as whether Sneferu was associated with the Meidum pyramid is somewhat contested. There are many theories for this, incorporating 2 or 3 pyramids, many of which are beyond the scope of this video, and I will get to them one day, I'm sure, but here the author questions the authenticity of the link between the pharaoh Sneferu and any of these structures that we just mentioned. The main piece of evidence brought into play here is the tenuous scrawlings of 18th dynasty scribe Anepokare Sem. Yeah, I've definitely messed that one up. Which is used to link the two Dasha pyramids to Sneferu. But Ellis argues otherwise. The author asks us to address the quality of these two perplexing constructions. Their construction is much more solid and sound than those pyramids that came shortly before them at Saqqara and Meidum, something that allows Ralph to question whether the pyramids perhaps do not exactly fit into the timeline established by modern historians. Instead, the author proposes that these pyramids are up to 12,000 years old. Now, let's take a look at some of the evidence that is being given to reach this startling conclusion. The clue, it seems, is in the casing stones of the pyramids at both Giza and Dashur. Now, quite famously, the original casing stones are missing from most of the Giza pyramids. The Bent pyramid, in comparison, has a large amount of its initial casing stones intact. In studying the pavement stones around these monuments, Ralph has been able to come to some interesting conclusions regarding the true age of the pyramids. Over the many millennia, erosion and weathering took place on and around the pyramids in their original fully cladded form. Then at some point in history, the casing stones were lost in some way. Let me quote directly here. Quote, "After many millennia, someone came along and started pilfering the cladding stones from the pyramids, something that is usually ascribed to the Muslim invasion of the 8th or 9th century AD. From this time onwards, the whole of the paving slab was now exposed to the elements and started to weather. Hence, a line was formed in the paving stones between the two periods of weathering." End quote. Ralph clarifies that by studying this line and the differences in weathering and erosion on both sides of it, we can better ascertain the true age of the pyramid. On a visit to both sites, the author was studying and measuring this weathering in order to come up to the conclusion noted in the book. I'm going to quote directly here again, and I don't like to copy and paste huge blocks of text like this into my videos, but I want to get Ralph's words exactly right here in order to get across exactly what he's saying. Quote, "With ruler in hand, I tried to estimate the extent of the erosion using the base of the remaining facing blocks as a guide to the original surface of the pavement. It was not the most precise of experiments, given the tools at my disposal, but luckily the amount of erosion was easily visible. At Dashur, the amount of erosion on the covered half of the slab was approximately 5 millimeters, the sort of erosion one might expect in such a climate over 1,000 years of weathering. Yet on the exposed portion of the stone, there was about 50 millimeters of erosion. At Giza, the differential was even greater. The amount of erosion on the covered portion of the stone was again about 5 millimeters, and the exposed section had between 50 millimeters and a massive 200 millimeters of erosion." End quote. Using this method of measuring, Ralph is able to see that the level of erosion that has taken place on the always exposed part of the pavement stone is roughly about 10 times more than what is on the other side of the line, which would have been under the casing stones until they were removed. Now, if you say there's been roughly 1,000 years worth of erosion since the casing stones were removed, just to use a round figure, it's quite easy to say, well, if there's 10 times as much erosion on the remaining stone, then that would make the pyramids at least 10,000 years old, right? It's an interesting thought, and one that's definitely got me staring at pictures of pavement around the Giza pyramid a bit more for all the good that'll do. In the next section, the author covers a lot of what we actually went over in my last video, that being the placement and the properties of the pyramid attributed to Khafre. Ralph refers to it here as the second pyramid of Giza, as not to link it to the traditional dynastic pharaohic timeline. He questions, as we did, as many other people have over hundreds of years, I'm sure, what was it that made that exact, precise location so important for the placement of the pyramid of Khafre? Ralph proposes the following conclusion. Quote, "Placing the second pyramid in this precise location was very difficult for the designer, and a tremendous amount of work was wasted in levelling the site. This clearly indicates that the position of this pyramid was critical, and it directly supports the concept that these three pyramids were deliberately placed together to mimic the outline of the belt of the constellation of Orion." End quote. Sound a bit familiar? This is of course one of the main parts of the Orion correlation theory. We covered this in depth last year on the channel when we analysed the work of Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert on linking the pyramids of Giza with the stars. In fact, this is how I first came into contact with Ralph, as we discussed at the start of the video, after he left a very interesting comment on that very video. Now, Ellis's work is actually rather inextricably linked to that of Bauval's, for better or worse. And well, that's another story for another time. You can find that information online if you are so inclined. Sticking with that theory for a moment then, we should also address the so-called star shafts of the Great Pyramid. Ralph actually dismisses their astral significance entirely, at least in the way that they are depicted in the Orion mystery, stating plainly that the shafts do not point to stars. Instead, Ralph declares that the Great Pyramid interior is actually a blueprint, and the so-called star or air shafts are an important part of that blueprint. We will come back to this in much more detail at the end. The only exceptions here to the blueprint are the well shaft and the small tunnel leading from the Grand Gallery to the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber, now known as Davidson's Chamber. These, Ralph surmises, over considerable amounts of evidence regarding their construction and purpose, were both later additions to the pyramid. After studying the pyramids of Dashur and Giza, the next question the author asks again is one that has been asked many times before. Why does pyramid building fall off so hard after the 4th dynasty? From the 5th dynasty onwards, the size and stability and therefore longevity of all Egyptian pyramids declined rapidly. None stand to this day as proudly and as defiantly against all odds as the ones at Giza and Dashur. To those who start looking into pyramids, it's one of the first startling things you'd notice, I'd say. Most of the later pyramids are merely more than mounds of dirt today, and none of them have any chambers or tunnels that are above ground, like the maddeningly complex interior chambers of something like the Great Pyramid. There's an interesting point to raise, however, that until the upper chambers of the Great Pyramid were breached, possibly as late as Al-Mamun, long after any Egyptian dynasty, it's possible that all was known in antiquity of the Great Pyramid's interior to later Egyptian dynasties was the descending passageway and the subterranean chamber. Now, is this why later pyramid interiors are far simpler than the Great Pyramid? Because the secrets of its many complex chambers and corridors lay hidden behind blocking stones for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is not entirely implausible, as we are still finding tunnels and chambers in this thing even today. But there is more to the decline of pyramid building than the complexity of the interiors. Most later pyramids, if they have even survived at all, are now just mounds of earth or rocks, having succumbed to the ravages of time. So why are the later pyramids not as well made as the ones that came before them? The most obvious reason for this in the traditionally established timeline is cost, or political upheaval, or both. Ralph, however, peels back a few more layers. Why did Shepseskaf, the final pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, not even bother building a pyramid? Why did Pharaoh Djefre revert to a design similar to Zoser's step pyramid from the end of the 3rd dynasty, which supposedly came before all of the giants at Dashur and Giza that still stand to this day? Granted, the Zoser step pyramid has stood the test of time too, but Djefre's hasn't. Why revert to such an old design? Again, was cost a driving factor? Whether that be a political cost or financial cost rather, in regards to resources and manpower? Who knows? Ralph gives many other examples of poor pyramid building that followed this apparent golden age before stating the following, quote, "The volume of masonry involved in these projects underlines the absurdity of the classical chronology. The 4th dynasty pharaohs managed to quarry and use 2.5 times as much masonry in 100 years as all the other dynasties managed in 800 years. So for a brief moment in time, the world's greatest buildings ever constructed were built, and, as has been pointed out many times before, the classical chronology for the construction of the pyramids is therefore a little peculiar." End quote. Ellis therefore concludes that either some kind of advanced technology in the possession of the ancient Egyptians, quote, blossomed and then quickly faded away, end quote, or the accepted timeline of events that we have today is completely and utterly wrong. To support this, we need to go back to the erosion on the pavements around the strong standing pyramids at Giza and Dahshur. Using this again as a guide, Ralph suggests that these pyramids were built first, many thousands of years before the other more inferior pyramids and the more accepted chronology and order of events. The pyramids of Egypt, however, are but a part of this bizarre puzzle. The text now takes us, quite jarringly, to Stonehenge, quite possibly one of the most well-known landmarks in the entire world. The construction of Stonehenge does not seem to draw as hot a debate as that of the pyramids of Egypt, but it is still a remarkable feat. The focus, when conversations start about Stonehenge, often seems to be about the why rather than the how, although it is fascinating to ruminate how the blue stones of the Inner Ring, supposedly brought all the way from the Preseli Mountains in southwest Wales, made their way safely to the south of England. It's not quite as long a journey as the Granite of Aswan, making its way up to the Great Pyramid, but still, how this was achieved is an interesting topic in of itself. Likewise, there's been even more recent news that the altar stone of Stonehenge potentially came all the way from the Orcadian Basin in Scotland, but that is outside the scope of this subject for now. As for when Stonehenge was built, that is a tricky one to answer. There are various timelines, and on top of that, there are various stages in which archaeologists believe it was built. Case in point, just fire up Wikipedia, that ever-reliable source of information, just as an example, where the page will give you a wide range of dates from around 3000 BC through to 1600 BC, in which the site was added to. Ralph Ellis mentions the carbon dating carried out on bone found at Stonehenge back in 1950. The investigation, led by Dr. J. Stone, resulted in a date of around 3400 BC. The author, however, provides evidence that these burials were most likely later additions. The issue we have with Stonehenge, as with the pyramids of Giza, at least when it comes to the structures themselves rather than the circumstantial evidence around them, is that there is very little about Stonehenge that can be used to accurately date it. You cannot carbon date stone. So Ralph Ellis questions whether the lack of evidence around the monument's creation is not due to the details becoming lost to the passage of time between now and the time of creation, but perhaps it was a deliberate decision by the architect to obfuscate these details. Another part of the puzzle I understand we're moving quickly. Another part of the puzzle is the earthwork henge at Avebury, also in England. This is a considerably larger project than Stonehenge, at approximately 430 metres in length at its widest point. Ralph writes that the ditch at the circumference of the work was originally 10 metres deep at the point of its construction. Inside this ring was 98 sarsen stones. There was no additional work done to these stones like the granite worked for the pyramids, for instance. They were erected in their natural state. Inside this ring of 98 sarsen stones, which has divided itself into 4 segments, is 2 further stone rings, one of 29 stones and the other of 26 stones. Ralph tells us that the stones at Avebury remained untouched for many years until the onset and spread of Christianity, under which old, unknown, quote-unquote pagan constructions such as these began to be treated with superstition and even outright malice. The author writes an interesting anecdote regarding Christian attitudes to the massive stone circle. Quote, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the threat of the henge became too obvious, with the new church and priory nestling just under the great ditch, and so the monks in their great wisdom began vandalising the site. Groups of locals were organised into work parties. They dug deep pits beside the stones, rolled the stones into them, and buried them. The evidence that provided such a sure date was provided by a 13th century skeleton under one of the stones. The stone had apparently rolled prematurely and took revenge on its tormentor by crushing the individual to death. Coins in his pocket placed a firm date on the burying of the stone between 1320 and 1325. End quote. It wasn't until the 17th century, however, Ralph clarifies, that the monuments really started to come down in earnest. More sophisticated ways of taking apart the giant stones were now available, and stone itself was in no short demand, hence the destruction of Avebury sped along rather rapidly. It wasn't until the introduction of the Ancient Monument Act of 1882, spearheaded by Sir John Lubbock, who even purchased part of the Avebury site, that the vandalism of Avebury came to a halt. We will return to Avebury's purpose in this theory in a bit, but for now, we need to quickly introduce the final part of the puzzle, at least in the British Isles, and that is Newgrange, north of Dublin in Ireland. Ralph explains that Newgrange appears as more of a burial mound rather than a henge, but it does have a ring of megalithic stones around its perimeter, making it a henge. The author further compares it to Stonehenge by highlighting the presence of many Neolithic burial mounds that surround Newgrange. Comparing Newgrange to Avebury, we can see the very similar number of sarsen stones in the circles of each, with 97 at Newgrange to Avebury's 98. The author asks whether it is likely the sites both originally had the same number of sarsen stones or not. Comparing Newgrange to the Barrows of Wessex, Ralph points out that the Newgrange faces the sun of the winter solstice. Now this is in opposition to Stonehenge, which works around the summer solstice. Let me quote directly here on this incredible feature of Newgrange, quote, "The effect of Newgrange is probably the more spectacular, with the first rays of the winter sunrise penetrating the darkness of the chamber and illuminating the stones for a brief 5 minutes before the artificial cavern is returned to darkness once more. This dramatic event only happens on the 5 shortest days of the year, when the sun rises at its southernmost point in its yearly cycle." End quote. Ellis also compares the interiors of Newgrange and West Kennet Barrow, which is to the south of Avebury in England. But what does all this mean, and how does it all link together with the other monuments we've talked about today? I appreciate this is a lot, but let's keep going and see what we can piece together from the text. It is at this point in the book that Ralph introduces Thoth, the Egyptian moon god with the head of an ibis. We may already know Thoth from popular culture or history as the god of wisdom, knowledge, writing, science, magic, art, among many other things. But how does Thoth fit into this theory? He is, after all, the titular character of this interesting book. To begin, Ralph ties Thoth to the Great Pyramid in Egypt. He does this by first iterating that the pyramid itself was sometimes referred to as the sanctuary of Thoth. Now, this is not something that I have heard before. I have read that legend has it that Khufu acquired the secrets to build his pyramid from the hidden sanctuary of Thoth, and that it may have been built in its image. But I've never read that the sanctuary of Thoth is the Great Pyramid before, so this was a new one on me. Ellis also attributes the Greek version of Thoth, that being Hermes, as having his name derived from the word Herma, which the author advises means, quote, "a pile of stones." Such a name would be quite fitting for the god that was rumoured to have designed the Great Pyramid, end quote. Ellis, however, suggests that we remove Khufu from the equation at all and focus entirely on Thoth. And I'll be honest, I've been guilty of this. I've just been talking about Khufu and Thoth together. Here is where we start to see the puzzle coming together, at least hints as to how things are going to go. I'll quote again, quote, "Thoth can also be thought of as the founder of the esoteric and arcane underground stream, the eternal vine. These are widely used concepts of something passing through the generations and millennia. Thoth is also a global concept, with similar benign educational gods appearing on many continents around the world, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, or Contici in the Americas, and perhaps even Zil or Silbury in England." End quote. Fans of Graham Hancock's work will no doubt already be familiar with some of those names, in particular Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl. Are these, quote, benign educational gods, end quote, all actually the same god? Are they part of a now lost global power that once held dominion over the entire planet, perhaps? Focusing back on Thoth for a moment, Ralph suggests that he may have achieved his godhood in the same way as did Imhotep, the famed Egyptian architect and mathematician turned deity. Now, unless I'm mistaken here, what I think is being said is that Thoth built the Great Pyramid, and that Thoth's secrets the ones that are apparently lost to legend, are instead encoded in the pyramid, or pyramids, themselves. In the pages that follow this, a considerable amount of effort is made to match up the ancient measurement system used not only in Egypt, but in other ancient sites such as Stonehenge and Avebury. Whilst I won't go in deep on the maths here because honestly, I'll just make a pig's ear of it, Ralph is able to identify commonalities between the systems and bring them together using a unifying, universal unit of measurement called the Zill rod. The theory starts with a discussion of Alexander Thom's megalithic yard and rod. This was another series of hypothetical units of measurements proposed in the 1960s. What Ralph is proposing is somewhat similar to that. Thom's megalithic rod is a clean 5 yards, but what the author is proposing with the Zill rod is a measurement instead of 5.5 yards. The reason for this are numerous. The thought, Ralph says, originated around the later British imperial rod, which was also 5.5 yards in length. Ralph proposes that perhaps the, quote, evidence for an ancient 5.5 yard rod is an indication that the British measurement system has a longer tradition than it has normally been credited with, end quote. Secondly, the perimeter of the Great Pyramid of Giza is divisible by the multiple of 5.5. Ralph, perhaps judging the reader's probable skepticism at this point, asks at this point that more evidence would be needed to confirm that these were indeed the intended measurements used at the sites in his theory. Next, as we had touched on in the beginning, the occurrence of pi in regards to the monuments of Ralph's theory is addressed. Pi and its relation to the Great Pyramid is very well documented, and we have mentioned it multiple times here on the channel over the last year or so. It often comes in more esoteric or, unsurprisingly, mathematical alternative thinking around the purpose of the Great Pyramid of Giza. But how does it fit in here? Pi, or 3.14, or 22/7 as the nearest whole number fractional ratio, can be applied to the other sites. At the so-called Silbury Pyramid, Ralph argues that the 30-degree angle of the hill there does fit into the ratio of pi. The perimeter fits, with the perimeter of Silbury being 3.5 times pi times the height of the monument. For comparison, the Great Pyramid is 2 times pi times the height of that monument. There's a handy little diagram at this point that shows it far better than I could ever explain it. Ralph seems quite enamoured by the relevance of pi to these structures. He writes of how during a flight over Stonehenge the sun shone through the stones at such an angle as to cut a gigantic shadow of the symbol for pi onto the British countryside. He also writes, in regards to Silbury fitting into the ratio of pi, quote, "The implications of this were interesting. Apart from some stellar alignments and a possible measurement system, nothing much more complex had ever been proposed for the Neolithic sites in Wessex." End quote. But outside of the gigantic shadow seen from the sky, can pi be attributed to the world-famous site of Stonehenge? We only need to take a quick look at the shape of the Stonehenge trilithons to see where this may be going. Taking inspiration from how Egyptian cubits break down into the lower denominations of palms and how yards break down into feet, Ralph proposes that the Zill yard, which we discussed a few moments ago, can also be split down into the Zill foot. Let me quote directly from Ralph here as not to lose anything in the translation. Quote, "In support of this idea, we can turn to the Borum Itho burial in East Jutland and the Borre Fen tomb in Denmark, where measuring poles were found in both cases. Both of these poles had incised marks on them, which are thought to be spaced out in units of 1/5 of a megalithic yard. However, 1/5 of a megalithic yard is not a unit that has any real historical significance, so the meaning of these rods is uncertain. If we were to translate the marks on these measuring rods into Zill units instead, we find that the spacings equate more closely to 1/6 of a Zill yard." End quote. Apologies for some of my pronunciation of those Danish places there. Using the Zill foot unit then, the two main pillars at Stonehenge can now be shown as 22/7. Sound familiar? Zill feet in height and width, or the pi fraction. The important icing on the cake, however, is of course the shape of the trilithons themselves. Ralph references other historical monuments in Egypt that also resemble pi, such as the Temple of Horus in Edfu and a gate from the Temple of Karnak. He also draws parallels between the word pi and the Greek word pylon for gateway, which is fitting because in most of these examples we are looking at entrances of some kind. At this point, things drift off into Masonic theology, which admittedly loses me, but I'm trying to see the bigger picture here. It is relevant due to the shape of the Pillars of Solomon, and the author also touches on those who suggest the Greek symbol for pi was actually invented only in 1707 at the founding of the Grand Lodge of Masons in London, but he disputes this, providing evidence for its detriment from the Phoenician alphabet. The next chapter addresses Thoth's rod, and before anyone makes any inappropriate jokes, we are referring, of course, to the Egyptian method of measurement. Where do they tie up to these zil measurements that we spoke of earlier? So, the Thoth cubit, sometimes referred to as the royal cubit, is a measurement system proposed as used to create several Egyptian pyramids, but later pyramids from Khafre's pyramid onwards do not seem to fit this measurement system. As Ralph says, quote, "The dimensions of the second pyramid and its chamber, for instance, could not be cajoled into nice round or meaningful numbers." End quote. Ralph promises evidence that all of the pyramids at Giza did indeed use the Thoth cubit, but this doesn't come until the follow-up book, which I haven't read yet at the time of writing this video. What follows is a complex and difficult chapter in Thoth, the Architect of the Universe, which contains a lot of mathematics and figures and units of measurement, many of which related to pi in some way or another, or the dimensions of the Earth, something itself which is attributed to the Great Pyramid. I'll be honest, I found this part particularly difficult to follow. At one point we start comparing these measurements to a game of cricket, and Hitler and the Spear of Longinus are also brought up, which is a bit baffling. This general gist, however, at least as far as I can see, is to address how Thoth's ancient forms of measurement have survived down the many, many years of history. They may have been called something else, or used in various parts of the world, but something, or someone, somewhere, was carrying on the ancient tradition. As Ralph himself writes at the end of this particular section, quote, "What did the ancients really know about the dimensions of the Earth? It cannot be accidental that all these systems are interlinked in this manner. Is someone playing games with us and with history?" End quote. So, what is the significance of the Thoth ways of measurement, the Thoth cubit or the Thoth rod? Using this measurement system to revisit all of the pyramids of Egypt, we can find which ones do and which ones do not fit the use of said measurement, and offer an alternative chronology for the construction of the pyramids. Remember that this theory completely removes pharaohs from the picture. Ralph suggests that the use of the Thoth cubit at the pyramids of Meidum and Dashur means that they were instead constructed after the Great Pyramid was built, or at least after when the Great Pyramid was designed. We'll come back to this interesting idea a little bit later on. In the next chapter, the narrative switches back to Stonehenge and Avebury, where we address the possibility that Avebury is a potential representation of the planet Earth. This takes into account the smaller stone circle at Avebury itself being a representation of Stonehenge. And if we compare that to a picture of our planet, things start to line up nicely. I'll put a picture on screen, as a picture is much easier to deal with in this situation. One more thing is that there is a lot of maths before and after this reveal, and what follows is more work to show apparent cartographic evidence that links Avebury to the South Sandwich Islands. What are the implications here? So let's slow down and try to think about that. There's a lot to take in here, and the author knows this, writing, quote, "This is still all rather revolutionary. Can we really accept that Stonehenge man created an ocean-going ship and travelled to the seven seas? Not only that, but can we also say that they took with them a sextant, in order that they may calculate the latitude of a group of 7 islands? It's certainly a revolutionary concept, and I can well understand anyone who is shaking their head in disbelief. But read the data again and look at the diagrams. Is this not proof of a long-lost technological civilization that was living on our planet many thousands of years ago?" End quote. The trouble with this data and these diagrams is that they are impossible to reinterpret here in the video without A, the video being 4 hours long, and B, more or less lifting and shifting the content of the book from one format into another word for word, which is not what I'm trying to do with these kinds of in-depth reviews. What then is the significance of these few islands? Looking to Avebury, Ellis brings our attention to the central obelisk. Ralph argues that this revelation has been staring us in the face the whole time. For a moment, I thought I had accidentally picked up Oswald Spengler instead of Ralph Ellis, with the author writing, quote, "Many people's perceptions of history have been clouded by concepts of their own superiority in this world. People still tend to place themselves in a position that is so much more enlightened than that of their ancestors, and that those ancestors were in turn so much better than theirs, and this continues in an ever-decreasing chain, back to a time in the distant past where people had zero awareness and zero knowledge," end quote. Ralph concludes that the prevalence of attitudes such as this, as well as the stranglehold of organised religion on the public consciousness throughout many past centuries, are two possible reasons for previous generations not quite getting the message hidden in these ancient monuments. In Chapter 7 of Thoth, Ralph presents evidence that claims to firmly link Avebury, Stonehenge and Giza together as being designed as one unified plan. Enter the processional henge theory. Drumroll, please. The author claims that whilst Avebury and Stonehenge do not look very similar, they do have the same function. At Stonehenge, there are 4 stationed stones at the site which from an aerial view appear to indicate the presence of a rectangular shape. Likewise, you can identify 2 Pythagorean triangles from measuring diagonally between the stones. It's worth mentioning at this point that it is not known for sure whether these stones are contemporaneous with the rest of Stonehenge, but for the sake of this theory, it seems that they are taken as such. The author portrays this rectangle and triangles in megalithic yards, rather than the proposed zilliards from earlier in the text. The reason for this is, quote, "The megalithic measurements of these triangles are simple 8 times multiples of the Pythagorean triangle dimensions. What this proves is that these Pythagorean triangles were a real part of the original design, and that the designer knew of and used these complex mathematical functions. It also means that the megalithic yard is a real unit of length, for all the scoffing at this proposition in academic circles." End quote. The author goes on to argue, however, that the perfect fit of the megalithic yard measurement for this scenario does not invalidate the potential existence of the zilliard. Instead, it indicates the contrary. The next element of the processional henge theory is the heel stone, which is situated in the so-called Avenue of Stonehenge. Here, much evidence is given to show that the sunrise, which quite famously rises over the heel stone and shines in through the circle of Stonehenge during the summer solstice, is actually misaligned and does not match the true sunrise of today. The author attributes this to processional wobble, something that we have discussed before on the channel whilst addressing the Orion correlation theory at Giza. This, along with the barrows of Stonehenge too, the author takes to interpreting as processional barrows, might I add, where they are used to help draw an ancient map of the planet Earth. This so-called Avenue of Stonehenge shows the equator of the Earth in this model. Ralph believes that this is not a coincidence, and that this is the intended function of the monument, a processional model of the Earth. Now here's a diagram from the book which helps convey that a bit more clearly. Further work is done tying pi to the monument of Stonehenge to support this theory at this point in the text. Similar meaning is then attributed to the sarsen stones at Avebury, which functions something like a processional clock, if I have understood the text correctly. Okay, so let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the monuments at Stonehenge and Avebury function just as the author proposes. What, then, of the pyramids at Giza? Where do they fit into this puzzle and why? Chapter 8 returns us to the correlation between the ground plan at Giza and the stars of the constellation of Orion, something that we've touched on in detail before, as I've said. Interestingly, the pyramids of Teotihaucan in Mexico are also proposed to fit the Orion correlation model. We will come back to this a little later on. Let's focus on Giza for a moment. We have heard the arguments from various people about the age and the function of the pyramids of Giza. We've gone through Boval and Gilbert's star shaft theory here on the channel, and Graham Hancock, amongst others, have perpetuated that the pyramids and the Sphinx are far, far older than what is generally accepted as their build date. Precession is often used as evidence to support these cases. The pyramids in this theory as well as many others, are categorically not tombs, let me remind you. Ralph insists that any such thinking is struck from your mind. Quote, "We must overcome any preconceived ideas that the pyramids at Giza and Dashur were built individually as tombs. We have already seen enough data to indicate that the biggest pyramids in Egypt were part of one grand building project from the pen of the same designer, and that this project had more to do with maths than tombs." End quote. But the pyramids at Giza and Dashur are not the only pyramids in Egypt, right? As Ralph says, quote, "This brings us to the problem of the proliferation of pyramids in this region." End quote. Simply put, the other pyramids were imitations of these great constructions that still stood tall and proudly, long ago from a forgotten earlier time. One of the big mysteries of pyramid building in general is how the art seemed to degenerate so quickly in the years that followed the monstrous constructions at Giza and Dashur. Often, the question is asked, as we did earlier in this video, why did the pyramid age peak and then fall off, as it were? What Ralph is saying is that the original pyramids, those being the three at Giza and the three at Dashur, these have stood for countless millennia in comparison to the rest of the pyramids built in Egypt, which were imitations of the greats that still stand. Many of these imitation pyramids have now crumbled back into the dust from where they came. The ones at Giza and Dashur, or so it says here, stood before the rest, and they continue to stand today. But what is the importance of these pyramids to the whole theory here? We've briefly touched on the Giza pyramids already, and of course they tie to the stars of Orion, at least in this theory. But what of the three other pyramids? Let's dive deeper into this chapter of the book and try to put the pieces together. Let's start with the so-called Red Pyramid. Ralph writes that the Giza pyramids are all about stars, or representing stars. The Dashur pyramids, however, have a different purpose, with the Red Pyramid being a representation, he says, of a certain point in space, that being, in this case, the sun's pole. Ralph suggests that this is why the pyramid is known as the Red Pyramid. Quote, "The designer went to great expense to bring core stones of an iron-rich, rust-coloured sandstone all the way to Dashur. This was not without good reason." End quote. In regards to the so-called bent pyramid, Ralph suggests that this pyramid is a combination, an amalgam, of two different concepts. The bent pyramid rather famously has two different angles on its sloping sides. There are those that say this was done to correct a building error, but for me this kind of thinking is almost borderline offensive when you consider the amount of planning and preparation that went into the construction of these immense buildings. There are plenty of other theories about the bent pyramid, and I won't go into them here. It could easily be another video's worth, and plenty of people have already shone a light on the strange appearance of the bent pyramid as it is. But for the purpose of Ralph's theory, the author points out that the corrected angle, the topmost angle then, of the bent pyramid, matches that of the Red Pyramid. Here Ralph's diagram has them side by side. It is the bottom half, for a lack of a better phrase, that deviates from this plan. But why? The answer Ralph suggests is that the bent pyramid mimics two pyramids. The top angle, as we've covered, is very similar to that of the Red Pyramid. The bottom, Ralph suggests, is very similar to the angle on the sides of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So, the so-called bent pyramid, which Ralph here calls the Vega Pyramid, is an amalgamation of both the Great and Red Pyramids. Following? Again, my question is why? The explanation is given to us, and I best quote here, quote, "The bent pyramid is an amalgam of two concepts. The lower portion mimics the Great Pyramid in slope angle because the Great Pyramid is, as we shall see later, also a representation of the planet Earth. In this case, the bent pyramid may be related to the Earth in some respect. Quite possibly it was for this reason that the base length of the bent pyramid was made to equal 360 cubits, to mimic an earthly year. Likewise, this may be the reason for a small satellite pyramid being built immediately to the south of the bent pyramid. The ratio of the base lengths of the bent pyramid to the base length of this small satellite pyramid is 3.6 to 1. In the same fashion, the ratio of the diameter of the Earth to Luna, our moon, is also 3.6 to 1. In other words, the bent pyramid and its satellite appear to be a representation of the Earth/lunar system. End quote. In regards to the portion of the bent pyramid that matches the red pyramid, Ralph suggests this is done in order to represent a quote-unquote pole. Like the red pyramid represents the sun's pole, the bent pyramid, with its upper dimensions the same, may also be indicative of representing a pole in its own right. Personally, if anything out of this small section on the bent pyramid is a stretch, it's this part. But I do really like the idea of the bent pyramid being a combination of two other pyramid designs. I find this in particular very interesting indeed. Okay, so there's been plenty of work connecting the pyramids at Giza to celestial meanings. But where do these dasher pyramids come into play? Enter the idea of the royal planisphere. Drum roll, please. The what, I hear you ask? Well, bear with me here because this is going to be a difficult one for me to get right. Now, Ralph draws similarities between the locations of Avebury and Silbury in relation to Stonehenge, and between the bent and red pyramids in relation to the trio at Giza. There's a very handy diagram here which places these locations against the position of the poles of the Sun and the Earth in regards to the Orion constellation. I'll pop that on screen now. I'm sure you can see from this picture where this is going. Of course, looking at Orion today does not give this correlation. There is, of course, the perhaps somewhat convenient spectre of precession to come into play again. This, according to the theory, means that we can use this so-called royal planisphere to accurately date the construction of the monuments both in England and in Egypt, which were all created as part of one giant master plan, so saith the theory. This does get a little bit more complicated, involving Teotihaucan, as well as a correlation between the White Horse of Uffington, and the constellation of Pegasus, but that's the general idea. So how does this reveal the true ages of these monuments then? Well, the short version is that the theory claims it is possible by tracking the precessional drift of the celestial pole. This can be done, if I understand correctly, by comparing the current position of the celestial pole against its supposed position during the time of construction of the pyramids and of Stonehenge. But that's what we're trying to find out, right? The age in which they were made. Remember what I just said about the bent pyramid and the red pyramid in relation to Giza, and how that correlates with Avebury and Silbury in relation to Stonehenge. These are, if I can briefly recap, earth-bound representations of the poles of the Sun and the Earth. In each case, the angle, as shown in these diagrams, is 195 degrees for Stonehenge and 194 degrees for Giza. If built today, and if the theory is correct, then the bent pyramid would have been built in an entirely different place, with only a 3-degree acute angle instead of the wider range than before. Confused? Me too. I had to read it several times before it made any sense. Do I believe any of this? I hear you ask. I've got to say that, well, I don't think so, no. But my word, it is absolutely fascinating stuff, and I must commend Ralph for his work. I cannot begin to imagine how much time and effort went into putting all of this together. So if we take the 3 degrees of the modern pole placement in the earthbound form of the bent pyramid and subtract it away from the 194 pole angle at Giza, we get 191 degrees of pole drift between now and when the pyramids were built. The same can be done for Avebury in place of the bent pyramid because the pattern is the same. The 3-degree celestial pole position of modern day, subtracted from the ancient angle of 195, leaves 192 degrees of pole drift between now and when Stonehenge and Avebury, and potentially Silbury, were all built. You can probably now see where this is going. If you take the precessional rate of 71 years per each degree of rotation, there is some disagreement around whether the rate is 71.5 or 71.3 years, but 71 years it is. And you can very quickly work out what Ralph suggests is the true ages for the sites in England and Egypt. The calculations put the constructions then the Egyptian constructions at 11,670 BC, and the British sites at 11,340 BC. Now, this is a staggering amount of time, and far older than the accepted timeline of around 2,500 BC for the pyramids, and potentially something similar for Stonehenge, although sources vary wildly for this, but not to the point of nearly 12,000 years BC. Ralph does address carbon dating of various elements found in both countries. There is a dismissal of later burials at Stonehenge or discrepancies in the age of silt found at Avebury. Likewise, there was wood found in the sealed shaft of the Great Pyramid, as we've covered in several videos. Ralph provides supporting evidence for his dates by demonstrating how the cross-quarter sunrise would have appeared down the second or central Giza Pyramid's causeway. This ties up with the constellation of Leo, which again puts us in the age around 12,000 BC. Again, those familiar with Graham Hancock's work will have noted similar ideas there in regards to the Sphinx at Giza. Hancock is not the only one to talk about the Sphinx in this way, but there are interesting parallels to draw between these two theories at least. Are you still with me? Now, this is definitely a challenging one to get through. There's a lot going on here, and I appreciate it's not entirely clear exactly where this is going. There are a few more additional elements to this piece of work that we need to consider, and then we can put the whole thing together as a complete piece, a complete theory. Chapter 9 of the book then takes us to Teotihaucan in Mexico. This is going to be a fun portion of the video because I've really struggled to say this word properly. But hey, it wouldn't be a proper episode of Lines in Sand if I didn't butcher at least one name regularly throughout it. So, what of Teotihaucan? The site, like Giza, is dominated by a trio of constructions, namely 2 pyramids and a citadel of sorts, often attributed to Quetzalcoatl, another name that is frequently brought up by Graham Hancock, as we've already said. There's a lot more to Quetzalcoatl than just Graham Hancock, but once again, the parallels are there. Connecting the 2 pyramids, named the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, with the so-called citadel or temple of Quetzalcoatl, is the Avenue of the Dead, a central causeway that was once the central vein to a bustling city, or so it is said. Ralph, however, writes that the constructions at Teotihaucan predate any city that may have been built up around them. The celestial pole calculations we just touched on would bring the potential construction of Teotihaucan to 11,500 BC, far earlier than the accepted 800 BC in the mainstream chronology of South American history. But what is the involvement of Teotihaucan in this Thoth theory? Ralph writes of a missing 3rd pyramid that was planned for this site, meant to mirror that of Giza. He points to the Pyramid of the Sun here at Teotihaucan as having similar properties to that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. But this is a bit of a stretch, in my opinion. Outside of a 3-meter base length difference between the 2 pyramids, they look completely different. Again, further work is done to liken the layout of the monuments at Teotihaucan to the Belt of Orion, but I'm not convinced. The section of the book on Teotihaucan is short, and unlike the rest of the text, which goes into at times excruciating mathematical detail, the Teotihaucan section does not have all that much detail at all, at least in comparison to the rest of the book. Ralph takes us back to Giza at this point and discusses multiple elements of the pyramids, in particular the Great Pyramid, and the mathematics hidden within it. There is a lot to unpack here, as with most sections in this book, and it's hard to quantify from a retrospective point still how much of this is super relevant to the core theory. Some highlights include some backup data to support the alternative dating of the pyramid construction that was revealed earlier in the text. Ralph indicates that the slope of the descending passageways in all 3 of the main pyramids at Giza changes slightly with time, and this indicates which star was used to align the passageways and the time frame in which each pyramid was constructed, based on the movement of that star in the night sky with the passage of time and the inevitable result on the slightly different angles of each pyramid's descending passageway. The author also suggests that the Great Pyramid's shafts are not for pointing at stars, as we explained earlier, but explains that the details around this and their true function are addressed also in a follow-up book, so that's outside of the scope of this video. The very interesting stuff comes a little bit later when Ralph flips this typical diagram of the interior of the Great Pyramid to give us a completely different perspective. Looking at the Great Pyramid interior from west to east instead of from east to west, with the north entrance being on the left of the picture, you can then flip this image upside down to give what Ralph suggests is a very simplistic and stylized map of some of the continents of the world. The King's Chamber and its various ceilings being Africa, and the antechamber that housed the portcullis becomes Arabia, and the Grand Gallery goes on into being Asia. I'm not sure how I feel about this, but there are some interesting ideas around the ceilings of the King's Chamber and how they could represent various segments or sections of Africa, and the tip of the continent does somewhat mirror the inverted chevron blocks of the final chamber. But what is the significance of this in the wider theory outside of the creator like to hide mathematics and diagrams inside monuments? What bearing does the inverted map of several world continents, incomplete as it is, might I add, have on the overall theory? Well, maybe this monument and all of the others that we have touched on are pointing at something. Enter, with a final drum roll, the mythical Hall of Records. We touched on this briefly earlier on, but the concluding chapter of Thoth brings us full circle to the so-called Hall of Records. So, what is going on here? The subject of the book is the prospect of a single universal designer for all of these ancient sites and monuments, and they are in turn designed and encoded with secret messages that point us at something. That is the idea behind this. Ralph rightly senses the skepticism that readers will have at this point. He writes, quote, "Just fobbing the designs off onto a mythical demigod called Thoth or Zil, as I've been doing occasionally in the text, is by no means an explanation for these events." End quote. To follow this up, the author suggests 3 possible explanations as to how a potential single architect or planner was able to pull all of this off. 1. The architect had real and tangible assistance in doing so from the gods, whatever or whoever those gods may look like. Ralph cautiously admits that this is far the least likely of the presented explanations. 2. There was a technologically advanced civilization that once occupied the Earth that has now been lost, and our creator was a part of this technologically advanced civilization. I told you, didn't I, that the parallels with Graham Hancock's work would continue. Ralph, however, very rightly points out, quote, "How did such a hypothetical civilization make such tremendous advances in technology and science, yet leave no traces of their cities, transport network, industry, or trade?" End quote. And the final option, according to Ralph, 3. It was aliens. Yeah. This one really took me by surprise when the God option, option 1, was presented as the least likely of the 3. I did not expect this. It was a bit of trickery, actually, as Ralph himself writes in the text that the first and last options are kind of the 2 sides of the same coin. Quote, "Taken at the most basic level, the term alien could cover all of the gods that are central to the major faiths of this world, and so the majority of people across the world believe in some sort of alien visiting the Earth. God is merely an intelligent and powerful entity or individual that does not come from our Earth. At the end of the day, what is the difference?" End quote. Now, I will be honest, I hadn't exactly thought of it that way before, but I don't read all that much sci-fi or theology or anything along those particular lines, so perhaps my imagination is not as active in these areas as it could be. Ralph delves deeper into the alien theory over the next few pages. This is absolutely not a potential conclusion that I would have expected going into this work. Are we ultimately saying that Thoth, Zil, or whomever the architect was of this global plan is an alien? Or was perhaps imbued with the technology or the secrets of extraterrestrials? I'm also struggling at this point to understand how any of this relates to the legend of the Hall of Records. We're told in the text that the monuments point to the Hall of Records, but then the rug is pulled from under us with this alien stuff and it kind of gets lost along the way. Admittedly, I may be missing something, but at this point, my head has started to go. So, what do you think? There's a lot to unpack here with this theory, and I will raise you several questions to finish with. Do you think there is any validity to the ancient monuments of the world being connected, either in the way that Ralph proposes in this book or in other ways? Any other ways you may have come across that I am not privy to? Is there a tangible link between Giza and Stonehenge and the other sites we have discussed at length in this video? Is it possible that there was some sort of unified plan that spanned various countries? Or is it all of this complete hogswash? And that's before we even get to the alien question. It's quite a curveball to end the book on, and the video in that regard. So I don't think I'm quite done with this subject. It's perhaps far outside of the wheelhouse of the usual stuff that I cover here. In the next video, we'll go back to pyramids exclusively, but I'm intrigued to know more about all of this stuff. It started grounded in Egypt, but went far further afield than I could have imagined. And I hope to get the opportunity to speak with Ralph about his writing here. And I also have a copy, thanks indeed very much to Ralph again, of K2, the sequel book to Thoth. So no doubt there'll be more to unpack in there. I will finish though by saying that both Thoth and K2 are available on Amazon Marketplace in both ebook and physical formats. So if you're at all interested in learning more about what Ralph has to offer, definitely go and check it out. There's so much that I have omitted from this video. It would have been impossible for me to cram the workings out that he does into this video. It would have been 12 hours long. He is also the author of countless other texts on a range of historical and religious topics, and he has a YouTube channel. So I will link all of this in the description below if you are more interested in digging further. Anyway, for now, I'll leave it at that. Keep watching the skies, I suppose. All the best, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye for now.